The morning mist hung low over the grounds of Clarence House as Sergeant Michael Harrison adjusted his ceremonial uniform for what he believed would be another routine day of royal protection duty. 23 years of dedicated service to the crown had earned him respect among his peers and the trust of the royal family. His spotless record and unwavering loyalty had positioned him as one of the most reliable members of the elite royal protection squad. At 45, Michael carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had seen everything the job could offer. His gray eyes, sharp and observant, missed nothing in his environment. Today felt different somehow, though he couldn't quite place why. Perhaps it was the unusual tension he had noticed among the household staff, or the way certain senior officials had been whispering in corners during the morning briefings. The day began like any other. Michael took his position outside the Queen Consort's private study, maintaining the perfect balance of alertness and invisibility that his training had instilled in him. Camilla had always been cordial to the security staff, treating them with a respect that many of her predecessors had not shown. She often asked about their families and remembered personal details that surprised even the most seasoned officers. Around 10:30, an unexpected visitor arrived. Lady Margaret Worthington, a close friend of the late Princess Diana, had requested an urgent private audience with Queen Camilla. Michael had seen Lady Margaret before at various royal functions, but never in such an agitated state. Her usually composed demeanor was replaced by something that resembled barely controlled anger. As protocol dictated, Michael announced the visitor and ensured she was properly escorted to the study. The heavy oak door closed behind them, and he resumed his position outside. What happened next would change the course of his career and shake his fundamental beliefs about the people he had sworn to protect. The conversation inside began quietly, but, within minutes, voices began to rise. Michael's training required him to remain focused on external threats, but the increasingly heated exchange behind the door was impossible to ignore. Lady Margaret's voice carried through the thick walls, mentioning Diana's name repeatedly, along with words like conspiracy, cover-up, and the truth must come out. Michael had served during Diana's lifetime and remembered the princess fondly. She had always treated the security staff with genuine warmth, often bringing them tea during long shifts and asking about their children by name. Her death in 1997 had affected many of the protection officers deeply, and the circumstances surrounding the car crash in Paris had spawned countless theories and investigations. The raised voices inside the study suddenly stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that lasted nearly 10 minutes. When Lady Margaret finally emerged, her face was pale, and her hands were trembling. She walked past Michael without acknowledging his presence, her usual courtesy abandoned in her obvious distress. The sound of her heels clicking rapidly down the marble corridor echoed long after she had disappeared from view. Queen Camilla did not call for anyone for the rest of the morning, which was highly unusual. Typically, her schedule was packed with appointments, meetings, and correspondence that required constant staff interaction. Michael remained at his post, following protocol, but his mind kept returning to the fragments of conversation he had overheard. During his lunch break, Michael sought out Thomas Fletcher, a fellow protection officer who had also served during Diana's time. Thomas was known for his discretion and had been Michael's closest friend within the unit for over a decade. They found a quiet corner of the staff dining area where they could speak without being overheard. "Did you know Lady Margaret was coming today?" Michael asked, keeping his voice low. Thomas shook his head. "No advance notice. Emergency appointment, apparently." "Why?" Michael hesitated, weighing his professional obligations against his growing unease. "Something's not right, Tom." "The meeting, it didn't go well. She mentioned Diana, and there was talk about conspiracies and cover-ups." Thomas leaned forward, his expression serious. "You know we can't discuss what we overhear, Mike. That's fundamental to the job." "I know that," Michael replied, "but what if what we're protecting isn't what we think it is? What if there are things we should know?" The question hung in the air between them. Both men had dedicated their careers to protecting the royal family, believing in the institution and the people they served. The possibility that their trust might be misplaced was not something either wanted to consider. That afternoon, Michael noticed several unusual phone calls coming in for Queen Camilla. Her private secretary, Mrs. Eleanor Ashford, seemed unusually flustered as she fielded each call. Eleanor had worked for the royal household for 15 years and was known for her unflappable composure. Seeing her visibly stressed was another red flag in what was becoming a very strange day. Around 4 o'clock, a courier arrived with an urgent delivery that required the Queen Consort's immediate personal attention. The package was marked with the insignia of a prominent London law firm, Blackwood and Associates, known for handling high-profile and sensitive legal matters. Michael signed for the delivery as required by protocol and immediately escorted the courier to Queen Camilla's study. The Queen Consort's reaction to the package was unlike anything Michael had ever witnessed. Her usually composed demeanor cracked visibly as she examined the contents. Through the slightly open door, he could see her sitting heavily in her chair, one hand pressed to her forehead in a gesture of obvious distress. Within minutes, she was making phone calls, her voice urgent and demanding. Michael caught fragments of conversations that mentioned damage control, media management, and legal options. The calls continued for over an hour, each one seeming to increase her agitation rather than resolve whatever crisis had developed. As the day progressed, more unusual visitors arrived. Sir Jonathan Pemberton, a senior advisor known for handling the royal family's most delicate public relations challenges, arrived without his usual entourage. His typically confident stride was replaced by hurried, nervous movements. Following closely behind him was Rebecca Hartwell, the monarchy's chief legal counsel, carrying a briefcase that seemed unusually heavy for legal documents. The emergency meeting that followed lasted until well past Michael's normal shift time. Protocol required him to remain at his post until properly relieved, but his replacement was delayed due to the ongoing situation. As evening fell, he found himself still stationed outside the study, listening to increasingly tense discussions about exposure, liability, and protecting the institution. During a brief break when the advisors stepped out to make private phone calls, Queen Camilla emerged from her study. She appeared exhausted and older than her years, the stress of the day evident in every line of her face. For a moment, she seemed to notice Michael standing at his post, and their eyes met briefly. In that instant, he saw something that shook him to his core: guilt. The look was unmistakable to someone trained in reading people and situations. It was the expression of someone who had been caught, someone whose carefully constructed world was beginning to crumble. Michael had seen that look before, on the faces of individuals they had arrested during his earlier career in law enforcement. It was the look of someone who knew their secrets were about to be exposed. As Queen Camilla turned away and retreated back into her study, Michael felt the first real crack in his loyalty to the crown. For 23 years, he had believed without question in the righteousness of his cause. He had protected these people because he believed they were worthy of protection, because he trusted that they represented the best of British values and traditions. But the events of this day had planted a seed of doubt that he couldn't ignore. If Lady Margaret's allegations had merit, if there really was some connection between the royal family and a conspiracy surrounding Diana's death, then everything he had believed was built on a foundation of lies. The implications were staggering. Diana had been beloved by the British people and by many of the royal staff who had served her. If her death was anything other than a tragic accident, if there had been a deliberate effort to silence her or harm her, then the very people Michael had sworn to protect might be responsible for one of the greatest betrayals in modern British history. As his relief finally arrived and Michael prepared to end his shift, he made a decision that would change everything. He couldn't simply go home and pretend this day hadn't happened. He couldn't continue serving without knowing the truth about the people he was protecting. The questions that had been raised needed answers, and if those answers revealed corruption or criminality at the highest levels of the monarchy, then his duty as a British citizen might override his duty as a royal protection officer. The drive home through London's evening traffic gave Michael time to think about his next steps. He knew that pursuing this matter would be dangerous for his career and, potentially, for his personal safety. Royal scandals had a way of destroying anyone who got too close to them, regardless of their motives or intentions. But he also knew that he couldn't live with himself if he remained silent while serving people who might be responsible for Diana's death. The princess had trusted them all with her safety, just as she had trusted the royal family to treat her with honor and respect. If that trust had been betrayed, then everyone who had failed to speak up was complicit in the betrayal. Michael's modest flat in South London felt like a refuge after the tension of the day. He sat in his small kitchen, nursing a cup of tea and trying to process everything he had witnessed. The secure communications device issued to all protection officers sat on his counter, its red light indicating encrypted messages waiting for his attention. Normally, he would check these immediately, but tonight he couldn't bring himself to engage with the system that was supposed to bind him to absolute loyalty. Instead, he found himself thinking about Diana. He remembered her laugh, the way she would stop to chat with staff members others ignored, her genuine interest in their families and lives. She had been a bright light in what was often a rigid and cold environment. Her death had left a void that had never been filled, a sense that something pure and good had been lost from the world. If the allegations Lady Margaret had raised were true, if Diana's death was connected to some darker purpose, then Michael knew he would have to choose between his career and his conscience. It was a choice he had never expected to face, but one that now seemed inevitable. As midnight approached, he made his decision. Tomorrow, he would begin his own quiet investigation into the events surrounding Diana's death and any possible connection to the current royal family. He would be careful, methodical, and discreet, but he would not remain silent in the face of potential injustice. The loyal soldier who had begun the day was gone, replaced by a man who understood that true loyalty sometimes required the courage to question those in power. Michael Harrison was about to embark on a journey that would test everything he believed about duty, honor, and the price of truth. The transformation had begun with a single overheard conversation and a guilty look, but it would end with revelations that could shake the very foundations of the British monarchy. And, at the center of it all would be a royal guard who chose conscience over career, truth over tradition, and justice over the comfortable lies that had sustained him for more than 2 decades of faithful service. The next morning brought an unexpected change to Michael's routine. Instead of his usual assignment at Clarence House, he received orders to report to Buckingham Palace for temporary duty reassignment. The message, delivered through the standard encrypted channels, offered no explanation for the sudden change. After 23 years of service, Michael recognized this as more than a coincidence. His replacement at Clarence House was Sergeant David Morrison, a competent officer but one with significantly less experience and seniority. The tactical demotion was subtle but unmistakable to anyone familiar with the internal politics of royal protection. Someone wanted Michael away from Queen Camilla, and they wanted it to appear routine. At Buckingham Palace, Michael was assigned to exterior perimeter duty, a position typically reserved for newer officers or those being disciplined. The assignment kept him far from any sensitive conversations or private areas where confidential information might be discussed. It was professional exile disguised as a standard rotation. During his first day at the new assignment, Michael encountered Rebecca Sinclair, a junior protection officer he had mentored 2 years earlier. Rebecca was sharp, observant, and had always shown exceptional discretion in her duties. More importantly, she had also served during some of Diana's final public appearances and held similar fond memories of the princess. Sergeant Harrison, Rebecca approached him during a break between shifts. "I heard about your reassignment. Bit sudden, wasn't it?" Michael studied her carefully before responding. Rebecca had always been trustworthy, but the current situation required extreme caution. "These things happen," he replied neutrally. "Need to keep assignments fresh." Rebecca glanced around to ensure they weren't being observed. "I also heard there was some excitement at Clarence House yesterday. Emergency meetings, unexpected visitors, legal counsel showing up unannounced." The Royal Protection Service was small enough that news traveled quickly, despite official efforts to maintain secrecy. Michael wasn't surprised that word had spread, but he was cautious about how much Rebecca knew and why she was bringing it up. "You know how these things go," Michael said carefully. "Royal schedules change frequently." Rebecca nodded, but her expression suggested she wasn't satisfied with the diplomatic response. "Sir, may I speak freely?" Michael considered the question for a moment. Rebecca's serious tone and formal request suggested this conversation was about more than casual gossip. "Off the record?" "Completely off the record," she confirmed. There's something you should know about Lady Margaret Worthington's visit yesterday. The mention of Lady Margaret's name immediately captured Michael's full attention. He had assumed their conversation was private and that the details weren't widely known within the service. "What about it?" he asked. Rebecca looked around once more before continuing. "Lady Margaret has been making similar visits to other royal residences over the past 2 weeks. She met privately with Prince William 10 days ago, and with Princess Anne 5 days before your incident at Clarence House. Each meeting ended with emergency legal consultations and damage control sessions." This revelation changed everything. Michael had assumed the previous day's events were an isolated incident, possibly related to some personal grievance Lady Margaret held against Queen Camilla. Learning that she had been conducting a systematic campaign across multiple royal households suggested something far more significant was happening. "How do you know all this?" Michael asked. "My rotation has taken me to each of those locations recently," Rebecca explained. "I've been paying attention to patterns, especially anything connected to Princess Diana. Yesterday, after hearing about your reassignment, I started putting the pieces together." Michael felt a chill run down his spine. If Rebecca had noticed the connections, others certainly had as well. The fact that his reassignment had come so quickly after Lady Margaret's visit was beginning to look less like a coincidence and more like a deliberate effort to isolate him from future developments. "What exactly do you think is happening?" he asked. Rebecca hesitated, clearly weighing the risks of speaking openly. "I think Lady Margaret has uncovered something significant about Princess Diana's death. Something that implicates multiple members of the current royal family. And I think they're scrambling to contain the damage before it becomes public." The theory aligned perfectly with Michael's own growing suspicions, but hearing it articulated by someone else made it feel more real and more dangerous. If they were correct, they were discussing a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of the British government and involved people with virtually unlimited resources and influence. "Even if that's true," Michael said slowly, "what do you propose we do about it? We're protection officers, not investigators. Our job is to serve and protect, not to question or judge." Rebecca's response was immediate and passionate. "Our job is to protect the innocent and serve justice. If Princess Diana was murdered, and if the people we're supposed to protect were involved, then our duty is to the truth, not to them." Her words struck a chord with Michael that resonated deep in his sense of right and wrong. Everything in his training and experience told him to maintain his professional distance and loyalty, but his conscience was demanding something different. The conflict between duty and justice was tearing at the foundations of everything he had believed about his career and his purpose. That afternoon, while conducting his perimeter patrol, Michael noticed an unusual number of black sedans arriving at the palace's private entrance. The vehicles bore diplomatic plates, but the passengers were clearly British officials rather than foreign dignitaries. Emergency meetings were being held at the highest levels of government, and the timing suggested they were related to whatever crisis Lady Margaret had precipitated. Among the arriving officials, Michael recognized Sir Charles Blackwood himself, the senior partner of the law firm that had delivered the urgent package to Queen Camilla the previous day. Blackwood was known as one of London's most formidable legal minds, specializing in crisis management for powerful clients. His presence confirmed that the royal family was treating this situation as a serious legal threat. Following Blackwood's arrival, Michael observed several other individuals he recognized from newspaper photos and television appearances. Home Secretary Patricia Wells arrived in an unmarked vehicle, followed by the Director General of MI5, Sir Andrew Thornton. The presence of Britain's senior intelligence official suggested that national security implications were being considered. The gravity of the situation was becoming undeniable. Whatever Lady Margaret Worthington had uncovered wasn't just embarrassing to the royal family, it was potentially explosive enough to threaten the stability of the monarchy itself. The response was swift, coordinated, and involved the most powerful figures in British government and intelligence services. During his lunch break, Michael made a decision that he knew could end his career or worse. He used his personal mobile phone to conduct some preliminary research into Lady Margaret Worthington's background and recent activities. What he discovered only deepened his concerns about the situation. Lady Margaret had been Princess Diana's closest friend during the final years of her life. She had been one of the last people to speak with Diana before the fatal trip to Paris, and she had been a vocal skeptic of the official investigation into the car crash. For years, she had maintained a relatively low profile while privately continuing her own investigation into the circumstances of Diana's death. Recent news reports, buried in the back pages of several newspapers, mentioned that Lady Margaret had recently gained access to previously sealed documents related to Diana's final months. The articles were brief and provided few details, but they suggested that new evidence had emerged about the princess's state of mind and the threats she had been facing before her death. Michael also discovered that Lady Margaret had retained the services of Jonathan Crawford, one of London's most respected investigative journalists. Crawford had built his reputation exposing corruption in high places and had the resources and connections to pursue complex investigations that others might avoid. His involvement suggested that Lady Margaret wasn't just making accusations, she was building a case that could withstand public scrutiny. As the afternoon progressed, the stream of high-level officials entering the palace continued. Michael counted representatives from at least 6 different government departments, multiple legal firms, and several individuals he couldn't identify but who carried themselves with the authority of people accustomed to wielding significant power. The emergency response was clearly massive and coordinated, involving resources that would only be deployed for the most serious threats to national interests. Whatever Lady Margaret had uncovered, it was being treated as a potential crisis of the highest order. Around 4 o'clock, Rebecca approached Michael again during a shift change. Her expression was grim, and she carried a small envelope that she handed to him discreetly. "Don't open this here," she whispered. "Wait until you're alone and secure." Before Michael could respond, she had disappeared back into the palace, leaving him with more questions and a growing sense that events were spiraling beyond anyone's control. The envelope felt heavier than its size suggested, as if it contained information that could change everything. The remainder of his shift passed slowly, with Michael's attention divided between his security duties and his curiosity about the envelope's contents. The constant stream of officials had finally slowed, but the atmosphere around the palace remained tense and charged with barely contained anxiety. When his replacement arrived and Michael was finally free to leave, he drove straight home instead of stopping for his usual post-shift drink with colleagues. The envelope sat in his jacket pocket like a burning coal, its presence a constant reminder that he was crossing lines that could never be uncrossed. In the safety of his flat, Michael opened the envelope to find a single sheet of paper containing what appeared to be a partial transcript of a phone conversation. The speakers were identified only by initials, but the content was devastating. The conversation, dated just 3 months before Diana's death, included discussion of the problem that Diana represented, the necessary measures that might need to be taken, and the permanent solution that would benefit everyone involved. The clinical language couldn't disguise the sinister implications of what was being discussed. At the bottom of the page, Rebecca had written a brief note: "This is just a sample. Lady Margaret has hours of similar recordings. She also has financial records, correspondence, and witness statements. The story goes much deeper than anyone imagined." Michael read the transcript multiple times, each reading confirming his worst fears about what they might be dealing with. If the recordings were genuine, they provided evidence of a conspiracy to harm Princess Diana that reached the highest levels of the royal family and government. The implications were staggering not just for the individuals involved, but for the entire British constitutional system. The weight of the knowledge was crushing. Michael understood that he was now in possession of information that could destroy lives, topple governments, and reshape British society. But he also understood that remaining silent would make him complicit in what might be one of the greatest crimes in modern British history. As night fell over London, Michael sat in his kitchen trying to process the full scope of what he had learned. Princess Diana, beloved by millions around the world, might have been deliberately murdered by the very people who should have protected her. The car crash in Paris might have been no accident, but rather the culmination of a carefully orchestrated plot. The royal protection officers, including himself, had failed in their most fundamental duty, protecting an innocent woman from those who wished her harm. Worse, they had unknowingly participated in covering up the truth by maintaining their silence and loyalty to the crown. Michael knew that his next decision would define not just his future, but his character as a human being. He could destroy the transcript, forget everything he had learned, and return to his duties as if nothing had happened. His career would continue, his pension would be secure, and his life would remain predictable and safe. Or he could choose to pursue the truth, regardless of where it led or who it destroyed. That path offered no guarantees and promised only danger, but it also offered the possibility of justice for Diana and redemption for all those who had failed her. As midnight approached, Michael made his choice. He carefully photographed the transcript and uploaded the images to a secure cloud storage account. Then, he began drafting a letter to Jonathan Crawford, the investigative journalist working with Lady Margaret Worthington. The letter was brief and careful, offering his assistance in uncovering the truth about Princess Diana's death and expressing his willingness to provide inside access to royal security procedures and personnel. He included enough specific details to prove his identity and credentials without revealing anything that could immediately compromise his position. Before he could change his mind, Michael sent the letter and committed himself to a path that would test every principle he had ever held about duty, loyalty, and justice. The royal guard who had begun this journey as a faithful servant was transforming into something far more dangerous to those he had once served, a man with access, knowledge, and the courage to seek truth regardless of consequences. The transformation was accelerating, driven by evidence that painted an increasingly dark picture of those he had trusted and served. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new revelations, but Michael Harrison was no longer the same man who had stood guard outside Queen Camilla's study just 2 days earlier. He was becoming something far more powerful and far more dangerous, a truth seeker with inside access to the greatest cover-up in modern British history. 3 days after sending his letter to investigative journalist Jonathan Crawford, Michael received an encrypted message on his personal phone directing him to a seemingly innocent meeting at the National Gallery. The message came from a secure number he didn't recognize, but the specific details mentioned in it confirmed that Crawford had received his communication and was ready to move forward. The meeting location was chosen with professional precision. The National Gallery's crowded halls and multiple exit routes provided perfect cover for a clandestine conversation, while the public setting made any surveillance or interference extremely difficult to conduct without drawing unwanted attention. Michael arrived early and positioned himself in front of Turner's paintings, using the reflective surfaces of the protective glass to monitor the room's entrances and exits. His years of protection training had made such awareness instinctive, but today he was using those skills for very different purposes than he had been taught. At exactly 2 o'clock, a tall man with graying hair and intelligent eyes approached the Turner collection. Jonathan Crawford looked exactly as Michael had expected from his newspaper photographs, but in person he carried an air of quiet intensity that spoke to his reputation for pursuing dangerous stories regardless of personal cost. "Beautiful work," Crawford said, stopping beside Michael and studying the same painting. Turner understood light and shadow better than most. He knew that truth often emerges from darkness, but only if someone is brave enough to illuminate it. The coded opening confirmed Crawford's identity, and Michael responded with the agreed-upon phrase. "Some shadows hide things that powerful people prefer to keep hidden." Crawford nodded slightly and gestured toward a less crowded section of the gallery. They walked in silence until they found a quiet alcove where their conversation could proceed without interruption. "Your letter was quite detailed," Crawford said quietly. "Lady Margaret was impressed by your knowledge of internal procedures and your access to sensitive areas. But before we proceed, I need to be certain you understand what you're getting involved in." Michael had spent the past 3 days thinking about little else. "I understand that Princess Diana might have been murdered, and that people I've sworn to protect might be responsible. I understand that pursuing this could destroy my career and possibly my life. I also understand that remaining silent would make me complicit in covering up one of the greatest crimes in modern history." Crawford studied Michael's face carefully before responding. "What I'm about to tell you goes beyond anything you've imagined. Lady Margaret's investigation has uncovered evidence of a conspiracy that reaches the highest levels of government, intelligence services, and the royal family itself. The car crash in Paris was no accident, it was the culmination of months of planning involving multiple agencies and individuals." The confirmation of his worst fears hit Michael like a physical blow. Even though he had suspected as much, hearing it stated as fact by someone with Crawford's credibility made the reality inescapable. "What kind of evidence?" Michael asked. Crawford glanced around to ensure they weren't being observed before continuing. "Financial records showing payments to Henri Paul, the driver, from accounts linked to MI6. Communication intercepts revealing advanced knowledge of Diana's travel plans and specific instructions about the tunnel route. Medical evidence suggesting the injuries sustained in the crash were inconsistent with the official accident narrative. Each revelation built upon the previous one, creating a picture of deliberate murder disguised as a tragic accident." Michael felt sick as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. "But that's not the worst part," Crawford continued. "Lady Margaret has also uncovered evidence that Diana knew she was in danger. She left behind recordings, letters, and documents that detail specific threats against her life and her fears about certain members of the royal family." Michael thought about Princess Diana as he had known her during his service. She had always seemed somewhat isolated and often appeared worried or anxious in ways that hadn't made sense to him at the time. Now those observations took on new and sinister significance. "Why haven't you gone public with this information?" Michael asked. "Because we need more than evidence, we need unassailable proof that can withstand the massive resources that will be deployed to discredit and destroy anyone who threatens this conspiracy," Crawford explained. "Lady Margaret and I have been building an ironclad case, but we need inside help to obtain the final pieces of evidence." Michael understood immediately what was being asked of him. "You want me to use my access to gather additional information? Specifically, we need you to help us access certain secure areas and obtain copies of documents that would normally be impossible to reach," Crawford confirmed. "Your security clearance and knowledge of internal procedures make you uniquely valuable to this investigation." The request was exactly what Michael had expected, but it still felt surreal to be discussing treason against the crown in the middle of London's premier art museum. Everything about the situation was wrong according to his training and conditioning, yet it felt absolutely right according to his conscience and moral compass. "What specific information do you need?" Michael asked. Crawford produced a small piece of paper containing what appeared to be a shopping list, but Michael recognized it as a catalog of specific documents and files that would be devastating if obtained. The list included communication logs from the night of Diana's death, financial records from certain government accounts, and security footage from various royal residences during key time periods. Some of these items are stored at Buckingham Palace, others at various government facilities, Crawford explained. "Your current assignment gives you access to some locations, and your relationships with other security personnel could provide access to others." Michael studied the list carefully, his mind automatically calculating the risks and logistics involved in obtaining each item. Some would be relatively easy to access during routine duties, while others would require elaborate planning and significant personal risk. "How much time do I have?" he asked. "Lady Margaret is planning to go public within 6 weeks, regardless of what additional evidence we can gather," Crawford replied. "She believes the conspiracy is becoming aware of her investigation and may take action to silence her if she waits much longer." The timeline added urgency to everything they were discussing. 6 weeks to gather evidence that could expose one of the greatest cover-ups in modern history, while avoiding detection by some of the world's most sophisticated security and intelligence services. "There's something else you should know," Crawford said, his voice dropping even lower. "Lady Margaret isn't the only person investigating this matter. There are others, including some very highly placed individuals, who have been quietly gathering their own evidence. Your decision to reach out has accelerated a process that was already underway." Michael felt a chill of recognition. The emergency meetings he had observed at Buckingham Palace suddenly made perfect sense. The royal family and government officials weren't just responding to Lady Margaret's accusations, they were responding to a coordinated investigation that threatened to expose decades of criminal activity. "Who else is involved?" he asked. "I can't reveal specific names yet, but I can tell you that people within MI5, Scotland Yard, and even some current members of Parliament are part of this effort," Crawford explained. "Diana had more friends in high places than her enemies realized, and some of those friends have never forgotten or forgiven what was done to her." The revelation that the investigation had support from within the establishment itself was both encouraging and terrifying. It suggested that success was possible, but it also meant that the stakes were even higher than Michael had imagined. This wasn't just about exposing past crimes, it was about a battle for control of Britain's future. Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of a tour group, forcing them to separate and pretend to study different artworks. Crawford used the opportunity to pass Michael a small device disguised as a mobile phone charger. This contains secure communication software and detailed instructions for your first assignment, Crawford whispered as he moved away. Memorize everything and, then, destroy the device. Contact me only through the secure channels outlined in the instructions. Michael pocketed the device and spent another 20 minutes in the gallery before leaving through a different exit. The weight of what he had committed to was enormous, but so was his sense of purpose. For the first time since Diana's death, there was hope that justice might finally be served. The drive back to his flat gave Michael time to process everything Crawford had told him. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering, involving multiple government agencies and reaching the highest levels of the royal family. But equally significant was the revelation that a coordinated resistance was forming, composed of individuals with the resources and determination to fight back. That evening, Michael carefully examined the device Crawford had given him. The instructions were detailed and professional, outlining secure communication protocols and specific technical requirements for gathering and transmitting sensitive information. His first assignment was relatively simple, photographing certain documents that would be accessible during his normal duties at Buckingham Palace. But, as Michael read through the complete instructions, he realized that this was just the beginning of a complex operation that would require weeks of careful planning and execution. Each subsequent assignment would be more dangerous and more crucial to building the case against the conspiracy. The technical sophistication of the operation impressed and reassured him. This wasn't some amateur investigation driven by emotion or conspiracy theories. It was a professional intelligence operation conducted by people with significant resources and expertise. Lady Margaret and Crawford had assembled a team capable of taking on the most powerful people in Britain. Over the next several days, Michael began implementing his first assignment while maintaining his normal duties. The documents he needed to photograph were routine administrative records, but they contained financial information that could be used to trace payments and expose the conspiracy's funding mechanisms. The work was nerve-wracking but not technically difficult. Michael's security clearance gave him legitimate access to the areas where the documents were stored, and his years of service had earned him the trust of other personnel who might otherwise question his activities. But, as he progressed through the assignment, Michael became increasingly aware of changes in the atmosphere around Buckingham Palace. Security procedures had been quietly tightened, with additional checks and monitoring systems that hadn't existed the previous week. Someone was clearly concerned about potential security breaches. More concerning were the subtle changes in how other personnel interacted with him. Conversations became more guarded, colleagues seemed to be watching him more carefully, and his movements were being tracked more closely than usual. It was possible that his contact with Crawford had been detected, or that his suspicious behavior following Lady Margaret's visit had raised red flags within the security apparatus. Rebecca Sinclair confirmed his suspicions during a brief encounter in one of the palace's service corridors. "They're watching you," she whispered as they passed. "Internal security has been asking questions about your recent activities and associations. Be very careful." The warning sent a chill through Michael's entire body. If internal security was investigating him, then his time was limited. Discovery would mean not just the end of his career, but possible criminal charges for treason and espionage. Worse, it could compromise the entire investigation and put Lady Margaret and Crawford in serious danger. That night, Michael used the secure communication system to alert Crawford about the increased surveillance. The response came back quickly and was both reassuring and alarming. Crawford confirmed that they had expected this development and had contingency plans in place. But he also revealed that other members of their informal network were experiencing similar scrutiny, suggesting that the conspiracy was moving aggressively to identify and neutralize threats. "The timeline has been accelerated," Crawford's message read. Lady Margaret will be going public within 2 weeks instead of 6. We need to gather the remaining evidence immediately, regardless of increased risks. Michael understood the implications immediately. The relatively cautious and methodical approach they had planned was no longer possible. Everything would have to be compressed into a much shorter timeframe, with correspondingly higher risks and fewer saphagu.